Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Aditya here. Today we are covering a fundamental topic for anyone working with AWS: how users actually access and interact with AWS accounts and services. Okay, and you have a few powerful options, and understanding them is key to efficient and secure cloud management. You have few powerful options, and understanding them is key to efficient and secure cloud management. Okay, so this is your entry point to the cloud, and usually you have three ways to access AWS. At high level, there are three primary ways, and at high level, there are three primary ways users can access AWS. First one is the AWS Management Console, which is most familiar, which is the most familiar one, and we are using the AWS, which is the most familiar one, and we are using AWS Management Console till now in our course, right? Which is web-based graphical user interface. And the second one is the AWS Command Line Interface (CLI). By using terminal commands, you can able to access AWS services. Okay, usually this is used for scripting and automation. And as the name suggests, command line interface, you use some commands. For example, if you are using Windows, you will use command prompt, right? And if you are Linux or Mac OS, where you have terminal. In that terminal, you can execute some commands. By executing that commands, you can able to access AWS resources. So that is one way of accessing AWS. And the final one is the AWS Software Development Kit. Usually in simple form, we call it as SDK. So for example, right, for programmatic access from your application. So your applications want to access AWS resources from your Java code, from your Python code, or from your .NET code. You want to access some AWS resources, get data from the AWS, or insert data into AWS databases or S3 buckets or EC2 instances. In that case, you can use Software Development Kit SDKs for that. So there are three ways of accessing AWS, and knowing these three ways of accessing AWS for you is essential for you as a developer. Okay, so let's dive in. Uh, okay, let's dive into each of one. Okay, let's dive into each one. And this is the AWS Management Console. This is CLI and this is SDK. And if you observe here, CLI is a UI. CLI is nothing but an UI, user interface, right? We are using in our course. And CLI is nothing but your command prompt where you have to give some command like AWS IAM or AWS S3. So you can give some command to access the AWS resources, or you can write code and use AWS SDK software development kit, like how you import your dependencies like that. And you can able to write AWS code like this, right? Here we have an example of accessing DynamoDB, that is an AWS service, by using Java code. So there are three ways. Now let's dive into each one. We will start with the AWS Management Console, right? It is an web-based interface. You likely use to create your account or explore services. So initially anyone has to start with AWS Management Console. So everyone at the starting point, they have to start with AWS Management Console only, because the root user has to set passwords and all. Those are passwords and key pairs, right? So initially the root user has to use the management console to set up its users and their passwords. So for that, management console is must, and once you have all this setup done, you can use those users and those credentials to access AWS resources through CLI or SDK also. But AWS management is the most crucial thing in AWS ecosystem, and it is very user friendly, definitely, right? Since it's a UI, and which we are using currently also. In our previous sessions also we used AWS UI, where we created IAM users simply by dragging, simply by adding simply by editing the forms, and clicking on some buttons. Using that UI, you can able to add the users easily, and you can be able to spin up resources easily. And crucially, it's protected by our username, and ideally, and it can we can access this via a web browser. That is what we are doing earlier. And crucially, it is protected by username and password, and ideally we can use MFA also, which is highly recommended multi-factor authentication, as we discussed in our last video. This is recommended way for most direct and manual interactions. So using AWS Management Console is recommended if you are doing a direct and manual interactions where you want to spin up an EC2 instances one by one. If you want to spin up an S3 bucket one by one, right? You have to create one S3 bucket at a time by using this UI. So in that case, if you want to go with manual, you can use AWS Management Console, and which is easy to use, and we are using till now, right? And moving on to the next way of accessing AWS is AWS Command Line Interface, that is CLI. So we have this command line interface, and we can manage AWS via your terminal. So your command prompt or your terminal, right? And in the terminal, you will give some commands. By using that commands, you can able to access AWS resources. So the CLI is a very powerful tool that lets you interact with AWS services using text commands. Obviously, you will use some text commands to interact with AWS services in your terminal or in your command prompt. And it's a direct gateway to AWS public APIs, obviously, right? So instead of using an UI, you are directly invoking the AWS public APIs using some commands. You are invoking those public APIs directly, and usually these are usually this is ideal for scripting and automation. For example, if you want to create a 10 EC2 instances, right? If you go with CLI, if you go with Management Console, AWS Management Console, where you have to create one by one, and there will be an options to create multiple EC2 instances also. But if you want to script it, but if you want to script it, but if you want to script it and automate it, then AWS CLI is the very powerful tool. And the benefit is automation, right? You can develop, and the benefit is automation, right? You can develop scripts to automate repetitive tasks like launching multiple EC2 instances and backing up S3 buckets, right? But in console, you have to manually go and do all this stuff. By using CLI, you can automate by writing a simple script. And efficiency. For experienced users, it can be much faster than clicking through the console, right? If you are well-versed developer who are using CLI mostly of your development, right? And developers use CLIs mostly, and for them, this is very easy and convenient way than using a console. And one more ideal thing, it's a open source. The AWS CLI is a open source, and you can find it in GitHub. So if you type GitHub for AWS CLI, you will get the open source code for the AWS CLI, which is nothing but the Python code, right? The AWS CLI built on top of the Python SDK of AWS. So it's a Python code, and in turn it executes that Python code, and that Python code interacts with the APIs, AWS services, public APIs. And it's a fantastic alternative when you need to manage resources programmatically or quickly execute commands without the graphical user interface. So without using any UI, if you want to automate the task and just use some commands and access the AWS resources, in such scenarios, this AWS CLI is a very fantastic tool. And moving on to the next slide, that is access key. So you may wonder how we can access resources from CLI. From AWS Management Console, usually we use password, username and password plus MFA, right, to access the console. But when it comes to CLI, even SDK also, so we will discuss about SDK in the next slide, but I'm covering the password section, right, the credential section of CLI and SDK in this slide itself. So for CLI and SDK, right, to access AWS resources, we have to use credentials. Those credentials usually we call it as access keys. So in case of management console, it is username and password, but in case of CLI and SDKs, we call them as access keys. Now, how do the CLI and the next method, the SDK, get access? They use access keys, obviously. Okay. So your programmatic credentials, these access keys are nothing but your programmatic credentials. And these access keys are generated via AWS console for IAM users. So as I mentioned earlier, initially, initially the root user creates the IAM users and he creates the access keys for those IAM users. So the IAM users or the root user use those access keys to programmatically access AWS resources through CLI or SDK. And this access key consists of an access key ID, which is like your username with respect to your AWS Management Console, and secret access key is nothing but password. Okay, which is essentially like a password. So access key ID is a username and secret access key is your password. So there is an important note is these are generated through AWS Management Console for your IAM users. And as just like passwords, access keys are secret. Never share them and never embed them directly into your code or public repositories. Okay, users should manage their own access keys and best practices and best practice involves rotating them regularly. So these are as these are as good as username and passwords, right? And we are not supposed to share our username and password. Likely we are not supposed to share access keys and secret keys. And we are not supposed to hard code these things in our code. So these things should be uh, came from some secret manager, and also these things should be encrypted when you are storing in your code. Okay, and also you have to rotate them how we are rotating the AWS passwords, right? And for example, the access key would look like this and the secret key would look like this. These are fake values I have given here, and this is how they look like, right? Some alphanumerics and which doesn't have any meaning, but this is how AWS generates a unique access and secret keys for us by using these two as username and password in CLI or SDK. We can able to access AWS resources. And in the console, right, it will look like this. So access key section, you can create access key, and once you create an access key, it will show the access key ID and what created time and whether it's active or inactive. Those. And that's about access key. And finally, we will talk about AWS Software Development Kit, that is SDK. If you are building an applications, right? If you are building an applications that need to interact with AWS services programmatically, the SDK is your tool. So for example, you are writing a Python code, or you are writing a Java code, or you are writing a .NET code, or whatever it is. Your application wants to access some AWS resource. For example, read some data from the AWS S3 or some database in AWS, right? It has to access the AWS service and get the data. So it's like integrating your AWS into your applications. In such scenarios, right? In such scenarios, the AWS SDK provides language specific APIs, basically a set of libraries that let your application communicate with AWS. So this set of APIs are language specific APIs, whether it's Java, Python, or .NET, whatever the language you are using. It will give you that dependency. By importing the dependency and using those functions, you can able to programmatically access the AWS resources. And it allows you to access and manage it allows you to access and manage AWS services programmatically from within your code, right? You can directly write some function in your code, and with that function, right, directly it will interact with AWS service. And this SDK supports a wide range of popular programming languages like JavaScript, Python, PHP, .NET, Ruby, Java, Go, Node, Node.js, and C++. Okay, and there are also mobile SDKs for Android and iOS also, and IoT devices SDKs for embedded systems like Arduino, and IoT device SDKs also. Okay, and the great ex and the great example you might not realize the AWS CLI itself is built on AWS SDK for Python. So whatever the AWS CLI we use, internally the CLI will use the Python SDK, and this Python SDK will call the AWS services. And this is so how this show this shows this shows you how powerful and fundamental the SDK is. So here the powerful thing is SDK only because CLI also using the SDK, but here we are using a command prompt and executing some CLI commands, and internally the CLI commands again calling the AWS SDK to access AWS resource. So it simplified that. And AWS Management Console is giving a UI, and it will internally again do a API calls to AWS, right? AWS public API calls. So this is how you can programmatically access your AWS resources. For example, here we have DynamoDB async client, right? That means here we are accessing DynamoDB using this particular line, and this line we get it from AWS SDK for Java. So this is a Java code, and if you import that AWS SDK, it will give you these methods, these classes. By using these classes and methods, we can invoke the AWS services directly. And don't forget, even SDK also uses the username and password concept. Here, instead of username and password, we call them as access keys. So access key, secret access key, both will be stored in some secret manager while reading into the code. Do not hard code those values in your code, and using that you can able to access AWS resources programmatically. Okay, so in conclusion, whether you prefer clicking commanding So, in conclusion, whether you prefer clicking, commanding, or coding, AWS provide flexible and secure ways for you to manage your cloud resources. Choose the method that best fits your task and workflow. And console for manual and visual management. So, in conclusion, whether you prefer clicking, commanding, and in conclusion, whether you are preferred So in conclusion, whether you are prefer clicking, commanding or so in conclusion, whether you prefer clicking, commanding or coding, AWS provide flexible and secure ways for you to manage your cloud resources. Choose the method that best fits for your task and workflow. Choose console for manual and visual management. Choose CLI for automation, scripting and rapid commands. And choose SDKs for building applications that interact with AWS. And all methods request proper authentication. Okay, if when it comes to console you have to do password plus MFA, and when it comes to CLI and SDK use access keys and secret keys as we discussed. And thanks for watching. If the and thanks for watching. If this video helped you understand how to access AWS, please give it a thanks for watching. If this video helped you to understand how to access AWS, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe and hit a notification bell. So in the next one, see you in the next one. Thanks for watching my videos. Bye.